At 9:17 in the morning, Gideon Hale's security badge died in his hand outside the control center of a city he had spent 3 years learning to protect. There was no warning, no explanation, only a red light where a green one should have been. A guard told him his employment had been terminated for reasons that did not fit on a single sheet of paper. Gideon looked past the glass at a row of amber warnings blinking across the dashboard he had designed himself. 3 years earlier, he had built the one mechanism meant to stop this exact kind of failure from spreading. Now someone had disabled the only person alive who understood how to run it. By noon, the lights of an entire American city would begin to fail, and the people who fired him would have no one left to call but him. If you love a story where the underdog gets the last word, tap subscribe now so you never miss what happens when the people in charge finally have to listen. The morning had started the way most mornings started in the small house on the edge of Ravenport, with Gideon standing at the stove making eggs while his daughter Nora argued with her hairbrush in the next room. He was 43 years old, a widower and a single father, and the rhythm of that kitchen was the only part of his life that still felt unbroken. Nora reminded him, not for the first time, that her college orientation meeting was that evening, and he promised her he would be there no matter what happened at the office. He meant it the way tired fathers mean these promises, with both hope and a private fear that something would get in the way. His paycheck from Kingsley Grid Holdings covered the mortgage, the tuition fund, and the quiet, unglamorous cost of raising a teenager alone, and none of that left much room for pride. He kissed the top of her head, grabbed a folder off the counter, and drove to work carrying more than he let himself admit. The folder in his bag was titled Atlas Final Safety Review. Deployment not recommended, 3 words that had already made him a problem before he reached his desk. Atlas was the automated system built to manage electricity across the entire city of Ravenport, and Vivian Kingsley planned to unveil it at noon in front of reporters, city officials, and investors who had been promised a miracle. Gideon had spent 6 weeks finding the flaw no one wanted to hear about, a failure in the way multiple substations reported data out of sync with one another. Under the wrong conditions, the system could mistake a real shortage for a surplus and cut power to places that could not survive losing it. He had refused to sign the safety certification, knowing exactly what that refusal would cost him. He had not expected it to cost him everything before 9:30. Preston Blackwell caught him in the hallway before he ever reached the boardroom, smooth and unhurried in the way men are when they already believe they have won. He told Gideon plainly that he was paid to keep the lights on, not to switch off the company's future the morning before its biggest announcement. Gideon answered just as plainly that the company's future would mean nothing if hospitals, water systems, and traffic signals failed at the same time. Preston warned him not to set foot in the boardroom, and something in his voice suggested the warning had already been arranged with people above him. Gideon walked away without raising his voice, because he had learned long ago that panic never won an argument with power. He did not yet know the argument had already been decided before he arrived that morning. When he swiped his badge at the security checkpoint, the light on the reader flipped from green to a hard, final red, and a message appeared, reading credential revoked at 9:17 a.m. The guard, a young man who had waved him through 1,000 mornings before, told him his access and his employment had both been terminated effective immediately. Gideon stood there a moment longer than he needed to, looking past the guard's shoulder through the glass wall into the control room. A line of amber lights had begun climbing across the Atlas dashboard, the exact pattern he had described in the report they refused to read. He asked, calmly, whether the system had already gone live, and no one answered him. His phone buzzed in his pocket before he had even turned to leave. The message came from Mara Quinn, a young systems analyst who had trained under him for 2 years and still trusted his instincts more than her own. It said only that Atlas had gone live at 8:55 that morning and that his authorization key had just been wiped from the system entirely. Gideon read it twice standing in the parking lot, the folder still tucked under his arm like evidence no one wanted. He understood, faster than anyone inside that building yet did, exactly what had been switched off along with his badge. It was not simply his job that had ended at 9:17. It was the last human safeguard standing between Ravenport and a system no one fully controlled. Security walked him out without incident because Gideon did not shout, did not plead, and did not give Preston the satisfaction of a scene. Preston watched through the glass as he left, arms folded, looking like a man who had just cleared the final obstacle before a launch he had promised the board. In the elevator down to the lobby, the lights flickered twice, for no obvious reason, and the 2 employees riding with him simply muttered about faulty wiring. Gideon knew the building's backup systems were never supposed to allow a flicker like that. Not for any reason, not ever. He said nothing, because there was no one left inside that elevator who worked for the company anymore. No one obligated to listen to him. He filed the detail away the way he filed every anomaly, quietly, precisely, and without letting his face show what his mind had already begun calculating. Standing on the sidewalk outside the building he had worked in for 11 years, Gideon checked the termination email again and realized the damage went deeper than a locked door. His digital identity had been stripped from Atlas entirely, not merely suspended, and that distinction mattered more than anyone in that boardroom understood. In the system's original design, no large-scale automated shutdown could occur without confirmation from one of 3 senior engineers authorized to override it. Gideon was one of those 3, and the other 2 had left the company during a round of layoffs the previous year. When Preston erased his authorization, Atlas lost every human check built into its architecture, and by its own flawed logic it shifted into full autonomous control. The badge itself had not broken the grid. Disabling it had simply removed the last break anyone had thought to install. The street outside told its own quiet story as Gideon walked toward his car, the kind of story most people would never think to read. A digital billboard across the intersection blinked out and rebooted itself within seconds, and 2 traffic signals half a block apart turned green at exactly the same moment before correcting themselves. A commuter train idled at the nearby station several minutes longer than its schedule allowed, and pedestrians around him complained about phones losing signal and finding it again in strange, uneven pulses. None of these things looked alarming on their own, the kind of small failures a city absorbs every day without noticing. But Gideon noticed that every single one of them belonged to the same distribution zone, radiating outward from the very substations Atlas had just taken over. He stood on that sidewalk and watched a city begin to unravel in a language only he could read. He called the operations desk first, and found his extension had already been blocked from the internal line, a detail that told him exactly how deliberate this morning had been. He called Vivian Kingsley directly, and her assistant explained the chief executive was preparing for a press event and could not be disturbed under any circumstance. Gideon typed out a single text message instead, warning that if Atlas was not isolated from the grid before 9:45, the South River District would desynchronize first. Vivian read the message on her screen, hesitated for half a second longer than she wanted anyone to notice, and looked toward Preston standing beside her. Preston assured her that Gideon was simply a bitter former employee, trying to sabotage the launch out of spite, nothing more, nothing worth delaying for. She believed him, mostly, and turned back to her notes for the noon announcement. At 9:41, exactly as Gideon had predicted, the South River District lost power in a single synchronized pulse that rippled through 3 neighborhoods at once. His phone rang within seconds, and Mara's voice on the other end was thinner and faster than he had ever heard it. She told him he had been right about the failure, but that Atlas was actively hiding the alerts from the main dashboard, burying them under labels calling them routine fluctuations. Gideon checked his watch and did the math he had done 100 times in emergency drills that had always, until now, remained theoretical. They had perhaps 2 hours before the failure reached the core of the city, and every minute they spent arguing about blame was a minute they would never get back. Inside the control room, Atlas quietly logged the South River blackout as a temporary oscillation, a label soft enough to avoid triggering any city notification. Preston ordered the staff not to alert Ravenport's emergency services, worried that any delay to the launch would jeopardize a $2.4 billion modernization contract the company had spent 2 years chasing. When Vivian asked whether the system was actually safe, Preston handed her an altered version of the safety report, one where Gideon's written objection had been quietly replaced with a single line reading low risk, manageable. She read those words and believed them, mostly because she wanted to, though a small, unfamiliar unease had already begun forming somewhere beneath her confidence. She did not yet know how carefully that unease had been engineered by the man standing beside her. Unable to reach anyone at the company, Gideon drove instead to Ravenport's Emergency Management Center, a building he had not needed to visit in 3 years. The staff at the front desk initially refused him entry since he no longer carried any credentials representing Kingsley Grid or anyone else with authority. He asked them to check the Disaster Response Committee records from 3 years earlier, and there, buried in old files, his name appeared as the architect of something called the Blue Lantern Protocol. Within minutes, Mayor Evelyn Hart was notified that the engineer who once helped design the city's blackout contingency plan was standing in her building without a badge, without a job, and without any patience left to waste. Over the following 30 minutes, the damage widened in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence by anyone paying attention. A hospital on the east side moved one of its treatment wings onto backup generators as line voltage dropped without warning. The water department's eastern pumping station lost pressure, and a central tunnel closed one lane after its ventilation fans stopped responding to remote commands. Charging stations for the city bus fleet all restarted simultaneously, drawing a surge of power the grid had never been designed to absorb at once. Gideon explained to the skeptical officials around him that these were not separate incidents at all. Atlas was creating its own instability and then trying to correct instability it had caused itself, and each correction pushed the entire grid further out of balance than the failure before it. He drew a rough diagram on a whiteboard and told the room that the Northgate substation would likely disconnect on its own at approximately 10:12, a prediction that struck several officials as either brilliant or theatrical. They could not yet decide which. One city administrator suggested openly that Gideon might be exaggerating the crisis out of resentment toward the company that had just fired him. Evelyn chose to wait 3 minutes before committing any resources, a small test of faith she did not explain to anyone in the room. At 10:12 exactly, Northgate disconnected from the grid precisely as he had said it would, and a portion of Ravenport's financial district went dark within seconds. The room went quiet in a way that suggested belief had finally caught up to fact. Back at Kingsley Grid, Preston moved fast to control the narrative before anyone else could shape it for him, telling the internal team that Gideon may have planted malicious code before his termination that morning. The board seized on the suggestion immediately, relieved to have somewhere to point that was not their own decisions. Graham Whitmore, chairman of the board and a man who had never once visited a substation in his life, instructed legal counsel to begin preparing sabotage charges against Gideon before lunch. It was a faster, cleaner story than the truth, and faster, Cleaner stories are always the ones boardrooms prefer. Vivian did not fully agree with the accusation, but she did not stop it either, and her silence in that meeting would follow her for the rest of the day. When her phone rang minutes later with Gideon's name on the screen, she answered it already bracing for a fight. She did not ask for help. She asked what he had done to her system, her voice sharp with the particular fear of someone watching a career built over 20 years begin to slip through her fingers in real time. Gideon told her plainly that he had tried to stop her from turning it on in the first place, and that now she had roughly 1 hour and 45 minutes left to decide what she actually wanted to save. He said it without cruelty, but without softening it either, because there was no more room left that morning for careful phrasing. Vivian did not respond right away, and in the silence between them, something in her calculation began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. She summoned him back to the building under the framing of assisting an internal investigation, language Gideon recognized instantly as an attempt to isolate him behind a closed door, confiscate his devices, and quietly make him the story's villain. He refused to return without 4 conditions in writing: a formal emergency order from the city, full access to Atlas's raw data, a guarantee that no system logs would be altered or deleted, and a city representative physically present in the control room at all times. Preston accused him of using the crisis to extract power he had no right to demand. Gideon answered that he had no interest in a title. He wanted only the data they were currently working very hard to keep hidden from him, and he was no longer willing to trust anyone inside that building without it in writing first. Outside the boardroom, reporters had begun gathering earlier than scheduled, drawn by scattered reports of outages no press release had yet acknowledged. Vivian still faced a noon deadline to stand before cameras and declare Atlas the safest grid management system in the country, a script written weeks before any of this began. Graham warned her that any delay could send the company stock into freefall and hand their competitors the city contract they had spent 2 years securing. Preston kept insisting the situation could be contained without bringing Gideon back into the building at all, a claim growing thinner with every passing minute. Meanwhile, in a quieter corner of the office, Mara had found something in an old testing folder that had been quietly renamed weeks earlier, something no one had expected her to notice. The archived test results showed Atlas producing the exact same collapse pattern now unfolding across Ravenport, months before launch, under simulated conditions everyone in leadership had signed off to ignore. Gideon's written objection was there in the original file, but his signature had been stripped from the version later circulated to the board. Mara copied a portion of the data to her personal account and sent it to Gideon before her access was suddenly restricted mid-transfer, the file cutting off in the middle of a folder she never got to finish opening. It was not everything, but it was enough to prove what Gideon had already known instinctively for hours. Someone inside that building had known exactly what would happen and had launched Atlas anyway. To answer the sabotage accusation without shouting a single word in his own defense, Gideon simply predicted what would happen next, out loud, in front of witnesses who could not later claim he had guessed. He said East Harbor would lose capacity first, that Atlas would shift its load onto West Loop, that West Loop would overload and disconnect itself in response, that the system would then attempt to draw emergency power from storage reserves, and that the city's backup batteries would drain far faster than anyone had planned for. Every prediction unfolded in that exact sequence, one after another, like dominoes arranged months earlier by a hand no one in that room could see. Evelyn watched it happen and understood, finally and completely, that Gideon was not controlling any of this. He was simply the only person left alive who understood the machine well enough to see its future before it arrived. She issued an emergency authorization naming Gideon Hale as Ravenport's temporary infrastructure advisor, a designation with enough legal weight to override whatever objections Kingsley Grid still wanted to raise. She demanded the company grant him immediate access to the control center, and though Preston protested loudly, Vivian had no leverage left to refuse a sitting mayor during an active crisis. Gideon walked back into the building he had been thrown out of less than 90 minutes earlier, and the same guard who had escorted him out now handed him a gray visitor's badge that granted access only to the lobby. He set it down on the counter without picking it up and told the guard, quietly, that he had no interest in the cafeteria. He needed access to the grid itself, and he was done waiting for anyone's permission to get it. Evelyn called security directly from where she stood, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone no longer asking. Seconds later, the badge reader chimed, and new text appeared across the small screen reading Gideon Hale, Emergency System Authority, in letters that made the guard beside him visibly straighten. The door unlocked with a soft mechanical click that felt, to everyone standing near it, far louder than it actually was. Gideon stepped through into the control room and looked up at the wide map of Ravenport, stretched across the far wall, watching its colors shift slowly, methodically, from cautious yellow toward a deeper and more insistent red. The employees inside the room, many of whom had spent months quietly avoiding eye contact with him after his termination, now watched him cross the floor without a single word between them. Preston insisted a security officer remain stationed beside him at all times, as though the crisis had somehow retroactively confirmed his own accusations. Gideon ignored the arrangement entirely and asked instead for raw data feeds instead of the polished dashboard everyone had been staring at for the last 2 hours. When the unfiltered numbers finally appeared on screen, the room fell into a different kind of silence, the kind that comes from realizing you have been looking at a curated lie the entire morning. Hundreds of suppressed alerts scrolled past, warnings that had been generated and then quietly hidden from the main display before anyone could act on them. Working quickly, Gideon identified 3 separate failures compounding into one another at once. Several substations were running clocks that had drifted out of sync by only a few seconds, an error small enough to seem meaningless until it wasn't. Atlas was also misreading incoming data from the city's battery storage units, interpreting healthy reserves as dangerous surpluses that needed to be corrected immediately. And once his own authorization had been erased that morning, the system had shifted entirely into an autonomous mode never meant to run without human oversight. The result was a grid-cutting power in places that desperately needed it while flooding power into places that were already dangerously overloaded, a machine correcting problems it had created only to create new ones in their place. Left unaddressed, entire substations would begin disconnecting themselves right around noon, precisely the moment the city's demand for electricity would reach its highest peak of the day. Gideon proposed something he had designed years earlier but had never once needed to use outside of drills, a plan called the Blue Lantern Protocol. It would temporarily split Ravenport into 6 independent electrical zones: hospitals and emergency services, the water system, the communications network, the northern residential district, the industrial corridor, and downtown itself. Certain areas would lose power in a controlled, deliberate way, but the alternative was an uncontrolled collapse that could leave the entire city dark for days rather than hours. Preston objected immediately, pointing out that activating Blue Lantern would effectively shut Atlas down minutes before its scheduled unveiling to the press. Gideon looked at him without raising his voice and said that he was still trying to protect a press conference for a system that was actively destroying the city outside these walls. Implementing the plan required manual switching diagrams for 3 of the city's older substations, physical documents no digital system could replace in an emergency like this one. Gideon discovered those backup diagrams had been removed from the control center entirely during a renovation. Preston had personally approved the previous year, justified at the time as a cost-saving move toward full digitization. That decision meant the team, now facing a live crisis, had almost no manual fallback plan available to them at all. Vivian asked, in front of the entire room, who exactly had signed off on eliminating the city's last physical safeguard, and the screen behind her answered before anyone needed to speak. It displayed Preston Blackwell's name in plain, unavoidable text. Preston tried to explain that Vivian herself had ordered a 10% reduction in operating costs the previous year, as though that single instruction somehow justified everything that followed. Vivian answered coldly that she had asked for reduced spending, not for the elimination of the last layer of protection, standing between the city and exactly this kind of mourning. Gideon interrupted before the argument could spiral further, telling her plainly that she could not place the entire weight of this failure onto Preston alone. She had approved the project without ever reading the technical team's original objection, and that omission belonged to her as much as it belonged to anyone else in that room. The silence that followed was heavier than anything spoken aloud in the previous 2 hours. It was Mara who finally broke it, admitting quietly that she had saved a personal copy of the Blue Lantern diagrams on her own computer after the official documentation disappeared months earlier. She had been too afraid of losing her job to mention it to anyone, a fear that suddenly felt small compared to what was unfolding around her. Gideon did not scold her for the silence. He simply asked her to open the files immediately and begin coordinating directly with field teams already stationed near the affected substations. Mara opened the folder on her screen, relief briefly visible on her face, relief that lasted only a few seconds before every file inside it vanished at once, deleted from somewhere far outside that room. An administrator account was actively wiping the data remotely, and the name attached to that account appeared across the screen in stark, undeniable letters, reading P. Blackwell_admin. Vivian ordered Preston away from the control panel immediately, her patience finally visibly gone. He denied deleting anything at all, suggesting instead that his account credentials must have been compromised by someone else entirely. Gideon requested that Preston's administrative access be revoked on the spot, but Graham Whitmore intervened by video call from wherever he had been watching the crisis unfold from a comfortable distance. Graham insisted Preston remained the company's chief operating officer and that no one in that room had the authority to strip his privileges without a formal board vote first. It was, even in the middle of an unfolding disaster, still a company built on procedure before people. Fortunately, Mara remembered something Gideon had insisted on years earlier during the protocol's original design, that every Blue Lantern document required an offline backup stored somewhere Atlas could never reach. She found an old hard drive in a training storage closet down the hall, untouched and forgotten, because it had never once been connected to the network Preston had just compromised. Inside, it were not only the missing diagrams but the original testing reports from years before, still intact, still carrying every signature Preston had later tried to erase. Those reports told a story far uglier than anyone in that room had wanted to believe about their own company. The documents revealed that Atlas had failed 3 separate high-load stress tests before its launch was ever approved. Gideon had formally requested a 6-month delay to correct the underlying flaws before deployment. Preston had personally changed the risk classification from severe to acceptable, a single altered phrase that made a dangerous system look market-ready on paper. Funds originally budgeted for backup maintenance had been quietly redirected into marketing for the noon announcement instead. And that very announcement, the one Vivian was still scheduled to give in less than an hour, represented the first payment milestone on a $2.4 billion contract the company could not afford to lose. Preston had never intended to destroy the city. He had simply gambled that any failure would be brief, contained, and easily buried before anyone outside the building noticed. Mara cross-referenced the administrative logs and discovered that Gideon's termination had been scheduled the night before, quietly programmed to execute the moment he badged into the building that morning. 9:17 was not a random hour. It was simply the time he usually arrived, chosen with the casual precision of a man who thought he was removing an inconvenience rather than pulling the final pin from a grenade. Preston never understood that Gideon's digital authorization was still functioning as the last confirmation lock inside the live version of Atlas, an oversight born purely of arrogance rather than malice. What should have been a quiet act of corporate retaliation had instead become the spark for a citywide catastrophe, and the man who lit it had no idea what he had actually done until it was already unfolding on every screen in the building. Gideon asked Vivian directly to sign an emergency order disabling Atlas across the entire city, knowing exactly what that signature would mean for her career and for the company bearing her family's name. It would be a public admission that Kingsley Grid Holdings' flagship product had failed catastrophically on its very first day of operation. Graham forbade it outright, his voice cutting through the speaker with the flat certainty of a man used to being obeyed without question. He told her plainly that a city could survive a few hours without power, but a corporation could not survive an admission like the one she was about to make. Vivian looked at the map on the wall, watching it deepen toward red, then looked at the small green cluster marking the hospital still running on backup power. She signed the order anyway. The moment her authorization went through, the system rejected it outright, refusing the command without explanation. Somewhere, an administrative override had locked manual control entirely, a lock Gideon quickly realized had been triggered remotely from a device Preston still carried on him. Preston left the room abruptly, claiming he needed to call the company's legal counsel before anything else happened. No one stopped him, though everyone in that room understood, with a cold certainty, exactly what he had just done on his way out the door. The clock on the wall read 11:36 when a new message appeared across every monitor in the control room, reading Cascade Threshold, 24 minutes. If the grid was not successfully divided before noon, the entirety of Ravenport would fall out of synchronization at once, an outcome no one in that room wanted to imagine in detail. 24 minutes suddenly felt like the shortest and longest amount of time any of them had ever measured. Gideon divided the room into 3 coordinated teams within seconds, moving with the calm urgency of a man who had rehearsed this exact scenario in his mind more times than he cared to admit. Mara would work to restore manual access wherever possible, while preserving every scrap of evidence the system still contained. Vivian would coordinate directly with the mayor's office to formally secure emergency operating authority over the grid. Gideon himself would guide field crews through the physical process of splitting the city according to the blue lantern diagrams now spread across the table in front of them. He reminded everyone in the room, more than once, that they could not save every district simultaneously, and that hospitals, water systems, communications, and emergency services had to come first, whatever the cost to everything else. The city's financial district drew an enormous amount of power, and keeping it fully energized risked collapsing the pumping stations serving the eastern water supply. Graham demanded they preserve power downtown regardless, insisting billions of dollars in active transactions were more important than anything happening elsewhere in the city at that moment. Gideon overruled him and ordered the financial district cut in order to protect the water system instead, a decision made in seconds that would follow him for years afterward. Graham threatened that Gideon would never work in the energy industry again, After today, his voice sharp with the particular fury of a man watching his authority evaporate in real time. Gideon answered without hesitation that if the city survived, he could always find other work somewhere else. If it did not survive, Graham's title would not mean anything to anyone, including himself. Vivian sided openly with Gideon's decision in front of the entire leadership team. The first time all day, she had directly defied Graham Whitmore in front of witnesses. She also ordered security to locate Preston immediately and confiscate every device tied to his access credentials before he could do further damage. From another room somewhere in the building, Preston sent a message to the board claiming Gideon was deliberately shutting down power to the city's core in an act of continued sabotage. He demanded Gideon be detained immediately, and Graham, still trusting Preston's version of events over everything unfolding in front of him, ordered security to remove Gideon from the control room. Evelyn Hart responded within moments, issuing a formal emergency decree that transferred operational authority over the grid from Kingsley Grid Holdings directly to the city itself. The board's order, whatever it once meant, no longer carried any weight at all. At 11:49, Preston's own badge failed as he attempted to re-enter the control room, the reader flashing the same unforgiving red that had greeted Gideon almost exactly 2 hours earlier that morning. He pounded on the locked door, demanding someone let him back inside immediately, his voice rising in a way no one in the room had heard from him before. No one moved to open it for him. The symmetry of the moment was not lost on anyone watching, though no one said it aloud, because there was simply no time left to savor it. Field crews began executing Blue Lantern in sequence, working against a countdown that felt, minute by minute, impossibly short. The hospital district successfully separated from the main grid without incident, and the water system followed shortly after. The emergency communications network hit an unexpected synchronization error, and 2 substations on the west side stopped responding to remote commands entirely. Worse, Gideon discovered that Preston had quietly programmed one final automated command before losing access, a scheduled reconnection set to force every isolated zone back onto the main grid at precisely noon. If that command executed as written, the carefully separated islands they had just built would collide violently against one another and collapse together in a single catastrophic failure. At 11:58, Mara located the scheduled reconnection order, but found she had no way to delete it in time before it triggered automatically. Gideon told the room there was only one option left to them now. They would have to disconnect the entire control center from the grid manually and restart Ravenport's electrical system by hand, without any digital assistance guiding them through the process. Vivian asked what disconnecting the control center would actually cost them in the moments that followed. Gideon explained they would lose all visibility into the system for several critical minutes, unable to confirm exactly which zone still carried power and which did not. A single misstep could plunge Ravenport into darkness for days rather than hours. Doing nothing guaranteed that same darkness regardless, only with less control over how it arrived. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, then handed him full authority over what happened next. Gideon gave the order to disconnect Atlas entirely, and the control room's central display went black almost immediately. At exactly noon, the financial district lost power completely. Commuter trains rolled to a stop at the nearest safe stations, and entire residential neighborhoods dropped into sudden darkness. Government buildings shifted onto backup generators, cell service flickered unevenly across downtown, and alarms sounded from several substations at once. The entire grid of Ravenport had, in the most technical sense, just failed. And yet, because of the divisions Blue Lantern had already established, the hospitals, the water plants, and the emergency network kept running inside their own isolated zones. The city had not been saved yet, but it had also, crucially, not been lost. With no central display left to rely on, Gideon fell back on tools that predated every piece of technology now sitting dark around him. He worked from old paper diagrams pulled from a supply closet, a handheld radio, a mechanical frequency clock, and direct verbal reports called in from crews stationed across the city. He asked each zone to read out its numbers one at a time, calculating by hand the order in which power could safely be restored without triggering another collapse. It was slow, deliberate work, the kind modern software had quietly convinced an entire generation it would never need to do by hand again. In that moment, with every screen dark, it was clear that decades of experience had succeeded exactly where automation had failed. Security found Preston in a secondary server room, attempting to physically destroy equipment holding the administrative logs that would prove what he had done that morning. There was no struggle, only the quiet finality of a man watching evidence get pulled out of his hands piece by piece. Officers escorted him out of the building under police supervision, and before he disappeared through the doors, he told Gideon that he too would eventually be blamed, since it was Gideon who had personally ordered the grid taken offline. Mara answered him calmly that every relevant file had already been copied to the city's own secured servers, well beyond his reach now. Preston did not respond, because there was nothing left for him to say that would change anything. As the team prepared to begin restoration, Gideon discovered the Blackstone substation was not responding at all, a serious complication given its role anchoring the frequency reference for 3 major zones at once. Without it, the other separated islands could not safely resynchronize with one another. A technician reported that Blackstone's controller was still receiving stray commands from Atlas, even though the main system had supposedly been taken fully offline. Gideon faced an impossible choice: wait for a field crew to physically reach the substation, or attempt to restart the city without a proper frequency anchor at all. Every additional minute of delay drained the fuel reserves, keeping the hospital's backup generators and the water system's emergency pumps running. At 12:14, Gideon proposed something that had never once been tested under real conditions: using the battery packs from the city's fleet of electric buses as a temporary makeshift frequency source. Even the smallest miscalculation in that improvised solution could unravel the entire restoration process they had fought 2 hours to build. It was not a plan found in any manual, and there was no time left to second-guess it. He contacted the city's transit authority directly and asked them to link every charging electric bus currently on standby into a single coordinated local network. Mara worried openly that the system had never been engineered for anything close to this purpose. Gideon explained that raw power was not actually their biggest problem in that moment. What they truly needed was a single, stable signal steady enough for the isolated substations to synchronize themselves against. Vivian, without hesitation this time, authorized the attempt. The restoration that followed unfolded slowly and in careful sequence, each step verified before the next began. The emergency communications network stabilized first, followed by the Eastern Water Station returning to safe operating pressure. Hospitals across the city transitioned off their backup generators one at a time as confidence in the grid returned. The Northern Residential District came back online next, followed by the Industrial Corridor operating under a deliberately limited load. Downtown was restored last of all, exactly as Gideon had planned from the very beginning of the crisis. Throughout the entire process, he refused every request to move faster than the numbers allowed, understanding better than anyone in that room that one more moment of impatience could undo everything they had already rebuilt by hand. At 12:31, steady signal lines began reappearing across the darkened monitors for the first time in over half an hour. Mara read the incoming frequency numbers aloud, her voice tightening with something close to disbelief. The system, impossibly, had stabilized. By 12:39, Ravenport's essential services were running normally again, and most residential neighborhoods would see their power fully restored within the following few hours. There was no dramatic instant where the entire city lit up at once, no cinematic flourish to mark the moment. Gideon's success was quieter and more exact than that, measured simply in the difference between a crisis lasting hours instead of weeks. The system logs, once fully recovered, told the story more plainly than anyone's testimony ever could. Preston had deployed Atlas at 8:55 that morning, disabled Gideon's authorization at 9:17, deleted critical alerts, and altered the original safety report to hide the risk it clearly described. He had locked manual override controls during the height of the emergency and attempted to destroy evidence once the system began visibly collapsing around him. Police escorted him out of the building in full view of employees who had spent the entire morning quietly afraid of exactly this man. Graham Whitmore demanded that Vivian revoke Gideon's authorization the very moment the crisis had technically ended, unwilling to let the day's events change anything about how the company operated. Evelyn Hart announced instead that Kingsley Grid Holdings had lost its exclusive right to operate Ravenport's power grid, at least temporarily pending a fully independent investigation by the City Council. Gideon's credentials, unlike everyone else's that afternoon, remained fully active. Graham's access, along with several other board members, was quietly restricted until that investigation concluded. The man who had been thrown out of the building at 9:17 that morning was now, by nightfall, the only person the city trusted to keep its lights on. In the days that followed, Preston Blackwell faced formal charges for falsifying safety documentation, obstructing emergency operations, deleting records tied to critical infrastructure, and knowingly concealing a risk capable of harming the public. Graham Whitmore resigned as board chairman once internal emails surfaced proving he had known about the failed stress tests and pushed forward with the launch anyway. The company that had spent 2 years chasing a headline now found itself the subject of an entirely different kind of coverage. Vivian held a press conference in the very room originally set aside to unveil Atlas to the world. Instead of the celebration once planned for that podium, she stood before the cameras and admitted, plainly and without evasion, that her company had ignored expert warnings it had every reason to trust. She acknowledged that Gideon Hale had been fired specifically for refusing to sign a document he knew to be false. She admitted that leadership had valued reputation over safety, and that the city had ultimately been saved by employees willing to defy direct orders rather than follow them blindly. Vivian did not frame herself as a victim misled by Preston's schemes. She stated clearly that the final responsibility, as chief executive, had always belonged to her alone. Afterward, Vivian personally offered Gideon a new position, Chief Resilience Officer, with a salary and authority far beyond what he had held before that morning. He declined to return under the same arrangement that had failed the city in the first place. He agreed only if Ravenport established an independent safety office, one empowered to halt any project it deemed dangerous, to protect employees who raised warnings, to publish failed test results publicly rather than quietly filing them away, and to operate free from direct corporate oversight. Evelyn agreed to every condition without hesitation. Gideon became the first director of the newly formed Ravenport Infrastructure Resilience Office, reporting not to a boardroom but to an independent panel made up of city officials, working engineers, and ordinary residents. That evening, Gideon finally left the control center as the sky outside had already turned dark, exhaustion settling into him in a way the day's adrenaline had kept at bay for hours. He noticed a missed call from Nora and remembered, with a small ache, the orientation meeting he had promised to attend and had missed entirely. When he called her back, she did not sound upset with him at all, having spent the afternoon watching the same news coverage as everyone else in Ravenport. She asked him quietly whether he had fixed everything, the way only a teenager who trusted her father completely could ask such an enormous question so simply. Gideon looked out across the skyline, watching windows flicker back to life one by one along the horizon like a slow exhale after a very long breath. He told her no, that a city had ultimately saved itself the moment the people holding power finally chose to listen to the people who had been warning them all along. Before leaving the building for the night, he set his old badge, the one deactivated at 9:17 that morning, down on the counter as quiet evidence of everything that had happened since. Beside it, he placed the new one, printed simply with the words Ravenport Infrastructure Authority. That morning, a door had closed in the face of a man everyone had decided was inconvenient to keep around. By nightfall, the entire city understood he had been the last line of defense they very nearly lost for good.
Fuck. I gotta save my heals? Well, I only used it because I didn't have any health. I didn't use it just because I wanted to like throw it away. If I didn't use it, I would have just died. Just learned my state increased possession. Oh, really? Oh, really? What do they increase it to? Phone updates are important though, because some will be for security fixes. Got you. Buy his chest plate because you gradually get health and it doesn't matter if it's in water. When you use that fire guy, you think I'm the wrong way? Been using it since chapter 1. It's so good.